Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, February 19th, 2025. Time for a not live, pre-taped show, but yet another show, regardless. So, just trying to keep you up to speed, given how many stories, we've already missed out on time to include. I'm hoping I can clear out some of the backlog so that we're not far behind when we return to the air live on Thursday. But who knows what will have happened while we were away on Wednesday. But all I can tell you, one, I can't tell you what happened this morning because this isn't happening this morning. Not for me, it isn't. It's Tuesday afternoon as far as I'm concerned. But one of the things that happened immediately after the show, or that I became aware of immediately after the show, that I thought might make a good way to kick things off, just continuing the trend of other senior civil servants at yet another agency in the United States government forced to retire after holding out as long as they could against the invasion of the DOGE forces. Reuters reports this one. Sarah Lynch from this also happening in the U.S. Attorney's Office. So not a new agency here, but another resignation from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Senior U.S. prosecutor resigns, not over the Eric Adams case, but over something completely different. And we're not even exactly sure what the different thing is. Check it out. U.S. prosecutor resigns, citing demands to open probe into Biden-era contract. What's happening here? We just don't know exactly, but with these guys, you can get a pretty good idea of what they might be after and why it's not legal for them to be doing this. Certainly not ethical for them to be doing this. The top federal prosecutor who supervised criminal cases at the Washington, D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office resigned on Tuesday, citing what she described as an improper demand by officials appointed by President Donald Trump's administration to launch a criminal probe and pursue an asset freeze. Another one of these things that President Donald Trump denies having ordered them to drop the Eric Adams case. It was simply somebody else's idea, I'm sure. And the launch of this investigation and freezing of assets, likewise, came from out of nowhere. In a letter to the interim U.S. Attorney, Ed Martin, reviewed by Reuters, the office's criminal chief, Denise Chung, wrote that the Trump administration had ordered her to investigate a government contract awarded during Joe Biden's administration and pursue a freeze on the recipient's assets. She said that neither request was supported by the evidence, which is kind of a big deal usually to these attorneys, which she said she was provided with by the Deputy Attorney General's office. So here's the evidence they gave her. It doesn't list what the evidence is, but here's the evidence why you need to start this case and pursue these asset freezes. I have read it, and this is not evidence of something that would warrant this. Well, then, do it anyway. And she wouldn't. I have been proud to serve the U.S. Department of Justice and this office for over 24 years, she wrote in her letter. During my tenure, which has spanned over many different administrations, I have always been guided by the oath I took to support and defend the Constitution, she said. The letter did not specify which executive branch agency contract was at the heart of the request or which entity received the government contract. Her resignation is the latest career Justice Department prosecutors to protest what they see as improper political interference by the Trump administration in criminal investigations. So there you go. It's not a great deal of specific information, but just one more in a pile of, frankly, corrupt and rotten-looking developments over at DOJ. All right. Today's also a great day to clear out some of these things that have been parked in Pocket that are blue sky posts that, even if they're not directly connected to the story I just read, I thought this one was interesting. And this comes from, I think, well, it's tied in both to the DOGE idea. The Peter Thiel is someone we should listen to idea. The Mark Zuckerberg is someone we should listen to idea. I did happen to see the other day, I think over the weekend, that Meta, Zuckerberg's operation, was launching Meta Horizon, which was some sort of, I guess, virtual reality world of sorts, in which, I don't know, you're portrayed by a cartoonish looking avatar, and you walk around and see things as if you're living in a video game, and you can visit with your friends and your friends' avatars and get together in groups and, I don't know, do certain activities. It's quite dumb, actually, if you ask me. I mean, apparently there are some people who enjoy it or whatever. What I found really interesting was, my recollection is that this was developed years ago as not by Meta, of course, but somebody else, as Second Life, right? Where you develop an avatar that represents yourself and you walk around and have interactions with your friends online. And I even, I recall participating in a couple of early podcast type interviews, which were supposed to be based in Second Life. And I could never I'm just not that great at this stuff, so I could never really get the hang of it, and wasn't able to really both concentrate on giving answers in an interview and manipulate my avatar guy. So I wasn't, but they would hold these interviews, and they'd be in a virtual auditorium, and people who wanted to listen would be seated in the audience. And it's interesting, but not something I really wanted to spend my time on. But apparently Horizon is something they've spent billions of dollars developing, and it looks no different. There's like no advancement from 15 years ago. And in fact, I think I saw somebody circulating a screenshot about how much like Second Life the thing looked. And I just was wondering what they had been doing with their time since then. But I was brought to this thought more, one, when I saw the screenshot of it. And it was, I think they were circulating an ad that was circulating over the weekend that they were running on Instagram, announcing, that they were trying to move people over to Horizon, and the ad was filmed. It wasn't filmed. It was a clip from a group of, these avatars that were meeting in Horizon and talking about, it was supposed to look like a support group of some kind. And the gist of the action, as it was in the little sketch that constituted the ad, was, okay, tell us your worst breakup stories, like how your exes broke up with you in the most inappropriate ways. And they all share, interesting stories. One broke up with me by text. One broke up with me with, a Post-it note in the refrigerator. I don't know. Just, they weren't particularly entertaining, but they were these cartoonish looking things speaking to one another about it. And it was honest to God, the dumbest thing I ever saw in my life. I can't imagine spending 5 seconds on it, in terms of using it. Griping about it, I'm happy to do. I found the whole thing astonishing, and it was of interest to me because this blue sky post that I have is from Oliver Willis over the weekend as well, just saying, look, I like a lot of stuff from Silicon Valley, but it's funny to me for the people who said, oh, what you want is 3D TV and VR glasses and Google glasses. And the public says, we don't want any of that. But what's funny to him, on top of all that, is now these guys position themselves as the people who really know what the American people want. They're going to take over government and run it just the way the real people want. The people who don't want any of these stupid ideas or stupid products or 3D anything or glasses that surveil your neighbors. Not interested. But yet these are the super brainiacs who are going to tell us what we really want in government. That doesn't make a great deal of sense. I think I'm in agreement with Oliver on that one. Did you see any of this? Did anybody notice this Horizon thing, or did you happen to see this ad? I was puzzled by it. I did get a response on Blue Sky from somebody who said, "Oh, my son really enjoys it. He talks to his friends who are in remote locations. They're on different continents. He and his friends, and so it's a very welcome development." About me, I use Zoom for that. I don't need to be a cartoon to do that, but look, whatever, to each his own. I'm sure there are people who enjoy it. I just can't imagine spending billions and billions of dollars on it. And apparently they have. And, I don't know why they're going to be astonished, but they will be when it turns out that people just don't really, normies just don't really want to get together this way. And of course, the idea of it being like, well, why did you make it a support group? Like, that's super depressing. I know a lot of people who are involved in support groups do want to go to their support groups for emotional support. But I mean, if you could be anywhere and look like anything, like, why would you be in a high school gym in folding chairs in a circle? I just don't think I'll be participating. Thank you very much. Not the top news of the day, I can admit, but we're cleaning out Pocket here, and we can go out of order and just go chronologically and plow through these things and make sure some of these stories get some play. There's another situation on the foreign policy front that we really have to catch up on. You remember it from past shows as political union with Russia to own the globalists. I've trademarked the phrase, and we're rushing headlong into that as well it began over in Europe when everybody gathered for the Munich European Security Conference, but it's carried on afterwards. Apparently, the Trump administration's foreign policy arm is intent on what they view as delivering, I guess, on Trump's campaign promises to do what? To end the war in Ukraine. Because peace. Everybody loves peace. Except this wouldn't be peace. This is just Donald Trump saying, can't we arrange it so that the United States, as the remaining global superpower, just gives Russia its permission? I'm telling you, as the head of the American Armed Forces, the remaining superpower, the nominal leadership of NATO, that if you want to go full-scale crazy and just bomb the living crap out of Ukraine until they submit and then occupy the whole country and keep it, we won't say no. That's the peace plan. You murder everybody and we'll say, what are you going to do? We won't oppose you. We'll stop sending them weapons. We won't. We might send troops, but we'll send troops as peacekeepers afterwards to help you keep the Ukrainians down. And apparently all of this discussion is going on, A, without the Ukrainians present, very unusual for peace conferences, and B, in Saudi Arabia, which for some reason has decided to host it. I guess they're like, well, when you think peace, think Saudi Arabia. Come to Saudi Arabia, a neutral third party, which gives gold necklaces to one of the parties to the negotiations and dances around with them with swords. And we'll build a Trump hotel for them. Just come on over here and we'll settle this for you. I don't know why this is happening. And on top of that, one of the most audacious things I've ever seen. Apparently, Trump is astonished that President Zelensky of Ukraine has not accepted his very generous terms for this. One, I'll let Russia beat the crap out of you and do nothing. Two, I'll show up with American troops later and make sure that you guys don't try to fight the Russians again. And three, for my services of brokering this wonderful peace, you will give me / the United States of America, but mostly me, mineral rights to 50% of your rare earth minerals and anything else that we deem to be of value under your soil. So we'll let the other guys come in and ravage you. We'll do the same and loot your natural resources, but only 50% of them. The Russians can take the other 50% because they'll own you now. And why aren't you interested? I'm not certain I get why you're turning away from this. Well, the Washington Post is reporting, at least on that part of it. They've reported on the Saudi Arabian angle too, but I think I have to go and grab a story to read for that. But this one from the weekend, U.S. presented Ukraine with a document to access its minerals, but offered almost nothing in return. And they must have been confused by this. I don't understand why you're offering me this document to take our minerals. A, I thought you were here to negotiate a peace. B, the thing you're negotiating is not peace. C, what do you mean minerals? And it's illustrated with a picture of the two sides sitting face to face across a table, the end of which is festooned with American and Ukrainian flags. And there's J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio sitting in the middle there as the lead negotiators for the United States across from President Zelensky. And they actually came to the table and said, stick them up. That's really rather remarkable. This conference, I guess, takes place in Munich. Emma Burrows is reporting for the AP here. The Washington Post picked it up, I guess. And, well, the facts of it are here. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he directed his ministers not to sign off. That's a good call. Not to sign off on a proposed agreement to give the United States access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals because the document was too focused on U.S. interests. And also, FU, I mean, is really... Trump has, I guess, recently heard about rare earth minerals, and now that's everything. He wants Greenland because he keeps saying, they have rare earth. They got the rare earth. We want their rare earth. And then someone must have told him the same was true of Ukraine. And maybe it is. I don't know. But yeah, now he's got a peace plan that involves, I want the rare earth. The proposal, which was a key part of Zelensky's talks with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference on Friday, did not offer any specific security guarantees in return, according to one current and one former senior Ukrainian official familiar with the talks. You get one half of my minerals. What do I get? Holy cow, look at the time. I got to go to Saudi Arabia. I'll see you later. Zelensky's decision not to accept the proposal, at least for now, was described as short-sighted by a senior White House official. I didn't let the ministers sign a relevant agreement because, in my view, it is not ready to protect us, our interest, Zelensky told the Associated Press on Saturday in Munich. The proposal focused on how the U.S. could use Kyiv's rare earth minerals, quote, as compensation for support already given to Ukraine by the Biden administration and as payment for future aid, the current and former senior Ukrainian official said, speaking anonymously so they could speak freely. Wow, that's a new one. Zelensky insists on security guarantees is the next section. Ukraine has vast reserves of critical minerals that are used in the aerospace, defense, and nuclear industries. Congratulations. The Trump administration has indicated it is interested in accessing them to reduce dependence on China, but Zelensky said any exploitation would need to be tied to security guarantees for Ukraine that would deter future Russian aggression. So it's not even necessarily the case that Zelensky is saying, no, I won't trade you mineral rights in exchange for protection from Russia. You should be protecting us from Russia because it's the right thing to do, which is a legitimate position to take. He's saying, you're not even offering us protection from Russia. You just want half of our minerals because there was another administration before you that helped protect us from Russia, and you want to get paid for that. What are you talking about? And of course, you tried everything you could to block that aid from happening when you were president the first time. Well, okay. Zelensky goes on to say, for me, it's very important the connection between some kind of security guarantees and some kind of investment, the Ukrainian president told AP. And I think that concedes too much, but he's trying to look like he's reasonable, I guess. Zelensky did not go into details about why he instructed his officials not to sign the document, how much is needed, which was given to Ukrainian officials on Wednesday by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on a visit to Kyiv. So it didn't even happen at Munich. It wasn't the vice president. It wasn't the secretary of state. It was the secretary of the Treasury handing them a bill. Wow. That's super insulting. It's a colonial agreement, and Zelensky cannot sign it, the former senior official said. Oh, who are we talking to? I don't know. Well, somebody who was given access or permission to speak freely, but I'm not certain who. One of ours or one of theirs. White House National Security Council spokesman Brian Hughes did not explicitly confirm the offer, but he said in a statement that President Zelensky is being short-sighted about the excellent opportunity the Trump administration has presented to Ukraine. Wow. The Trump administration has grown weary of sending additional U.S. aid to Ukraine, so they tried to stop it. And Hughes said a minerals deal would allow American taxpayers to recoup money sent to Kyiv while growing Ukraine's economy. Hughes added that the White House believes binding economic ties with the United States will be the best guarantee against future aggression and an integral part of lasting peace. He added, the U.S. recognizes this, the Russians recognize this, and the Ukrainians must recognize this. It's pretty interesting. And I've seen people referring to it as the von Ribbentrop pact here. The idea of just basically splitting Ukraine, or at least splitting the minerals. If the part of the deal is that the Russians just simply occupy Ukraine, they are interested in, I guess, and maybe that's what it was. He must have found out from Putin. Why is it, by the way, that you want Ukraine? I'm not clear on that. NATO encroachment, this, that. Well, they're not in NATO, and they're not likely to be as long as I'm president. So what's the real issue? I don't know whether he told them, or whether they had to go look it up, or whether it had nothing to do with what Russia is about. But rare earth minerals, I guess. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll let you conquer them if we can get half the rare earth minerals. That's all it comes down to. Wow. That's pretty sick, quite honestly. Let's see. Next section. Ukrainians worry about securing mineral sites from Russian attacks. That seems to be a problem. U.S. officials in discussions with their Ukrainian counterparts in Munich were commercially minded and largely concentrated on the specifics of exploiting the minerals and how to form a possible partnership to do that with Ukraine, the senior official said. The potential value of the deposits in Ukraine has not yet been discussed, with much unexplored or close to the front lines. The U.S. proposal apparently did not take into account how the deposits would be secured, because why take anything into account, really? And how would they be secured in the event of continuing Russian aggression? The official suggested the U.S. did not have ready answers to that question, and that one of their takeaways from the discussion in Munich will be how to secure any mineral extraction operation in Ukraine involving people and infrastructure. Any deal must be in accordance with Ukrainian law, for some reason, and be acceptable to the Ukrainian people, the senior Ukrainian official said. Subsoil belongs to Ukrainians under the Constitution. A Ukrainian name I have to deal with. Ksenia. Now, there are 3 I's in a row in this name, and I don't know whether it's a typo or for real. Like Zelensky, or you recall, has the 2 Y's in it. And it is supposed to be, I guess, in Ukrainian, like Zelensky or something like that, maybe. But Ksenia. I mean, what do you make of this? 3 in a row? I really, honestly, I couldn't tell you whether that's just a typo or for real. And that's just the first name. Orinchak is the surname here. That looks a lot easier than Kseniia. And it's not like this is in Ksenia Orachek the third, and the 3 I's just got moved. Wow. I'll have to look into that. Well, the more important part is the comment. Subsoil belongs to the Ukrainians under the Constitution. Now, the person speaking is the founder of the National Association of Mining Industry of Ukraine. There's no article or what do you call it in there? The mining industry, just National Association of Mining Industry. Okay. Well, at any rate, this apparently is a major concern. and they are unsure whether there would be, popular support for this kind of a deal in Ukraine. Zelensky, with the two Y's at the end, and Vance did not discuss the details of the U.S. document during their meeting Friday at the Munich conference. Okay, so the picture was of them discussing something, just not this. The senior official said that meeting was very good and substantive, with Vance making it clear his and Trump's main goal was to achieve a durable, lasting peace. The senior official said. Everyone loves that. Zelensky told Vance that real peace requires Ukraine to be in a strong position when starting negotiations, and stressed that the U.S. negotiators should come to Ukraine and that the U.S., Ukraine, and Europe must be at the negotiating table for talks with Russia. No Europeans at the negotiating table, asks the subheader of the next section. But General Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, all but cut Europeans out of any Ukraine-Russia talks, despite Zelensky's request. You can have the Ukrainians, the Russians, and clearly the Americans at the table talking, Kellogg said in an event hosted by a Ukrainian tycoon at the Munich conference. Pressed on whether that meant Europeans won't be included, he said, "I'm a school of realism. I think that's not going to happen." So that's a no, I guess. Ukraine is now preparing a counterproposal, which will be delivered to the U.S. in the near future, the official said. "I think it's important that the vice president understood me that if we want to sign something, we have to understand that it will work," Zelensky told the AP. "That means," he said, "it will bring money and security." All right, well, that's really odd of them to want security out of this alleged peace deal. But remarkable that they've actually, they're willing to put that on the table. Maybe we would give you some amount of mineral rights, if not 50%, but maybe 50%, if there was a feeling that you would really provide security and keep us independent from the Russians. Whereas the Russians say, no, one, we don't care about that. And apparently the Americans don't care either. We want 50% as back payment. What we want, I guess, to secure your rights in the future, who knows? And by the way, though, this is an interesting point here. The whole thing is unworkable. Like, if the Russians get carte blanche to roll in and do what they want from us, why won't they just take the rare earth minerals? And we'll be like, no, those were supposed to be ours. We had a contract. That doesn't sound like it's really going to work out, all that well, or at all, as a matter of fact. All right, let's see if I can't find something about the discussions in Saudi Arabia and hosting these discussions between Russia and the United States about Ukraine, but not included in the discussion. I found that to be a little bit odd. Here's one from, shall we borrow the New York Times' reporting on this one? U.S. and Russia pursue partnership in a head-spinning shift in relations. Yes, political union with the Russians to own the globalists. The two sides met in Saudi Arabia for their most extensive discussions in years. In addition to Ukraine, business ties were on the table because we're having difficulty doing business with all of those oligarchs, I guess. Here, a picture of another large conference table, also populated by both Russians and Americans. Marco Rubio is there. Other people I don't recognize are there. And then, of course, it looks to me like these must be the Saudis at the end of the table. Beautifully decorated, of course. And the flags of the three nations at the end. And golly, if that isn't really something. Anton Troyanovsky and Ismail Nar are reporting from Riyadh for this piece from just yesterday, the real yesterday. The United States and Russia moved toward a head-spinning reset of their relationship on Tuesday, agreeing to work together on ending the Ukraine war. Nobody there from Ukraine there. Financial investment and reestablishing normal relations, i.e. dropping all the sanctions, adoption stuff. Wow. Just been, on the table and an outright been an obvious goal since 2016, but never mind. The meeting between senior officials from both countries was a striking display of bonhomie. Is that how you would pronounce that? Bonhomie? After 3 years of American efforts to isolate Moscow for its 2022 invasion of, the people who aren't there, the Ukrainians. After more than 4 hours of talks, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and by the way, can I add, please, active measures to change the outcome of 2, 3, who knows how many more American presidential elections? But we don't acknowledge that anymore. Wink, wink. After more than 4 hours of talks, can you imagine talking to the Russians for 4 hours about political union? Gosh, that should have been like 15 minutes. 4 hours of talk. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said both sides had agreed to work on a peace settlement for Ukraine, as well as to explore, quote, the incredible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians, both geopolitically and economically. And by the way, also cybersecurity. Don't forget that was a major goal for the first Trump administration, cooperation with the Russians on cybersecurity. Great idea. We weren't just listening to each other, but we heard each other. Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said, I have reason to believe that the American side started to better understand our positions. They were going to surrender to them. I love it. The meeting, the most extensive negotiations in more than 3 years between the two global powers, was the latest swerve by the Trump administration in abandoning Western efforts to punish Russia for starting Europe's most destructive war in generations. Instead, how can we help? Let's partner. It signaled Mr. Trump's intention to roll back the Biden administration's approach toward Moscow, which focused on sanctions, isolation, and sending weapons to Ukraine that helped kill tens of thousands of Russian soldiers who were invading. Speaking to reporters after the meeting, American officials did not dwell on Russia's violation of international law in attacking Ukraine, or its alleged war crimes, or the 3 years of devastation that Russian shelling and bombardment had wrought in parts of Ukraine. Instead, they repeatedly lauded Mr. Trump for trying to stop the fighting by talking to Russia in a way that his predecessor did not. For 3 years, Mr. Rubio said. Mr. Rubio. No one else has been able to bring something together like what we saw today, because Donald Trump is the only leader in the world who can openly surrender to the Russians, apparently. That's what he means. Wow. Okay. The talks showed that rather than keeping the pressure on Moscow, Mr. Trump was eager to work with Russia to end the war, or do something anyway, an approach that would most likely fulfill many of the demands of its president, Vladimir Putin, and that he was prepared to cast aside the worries of American allies in Europe. The meeting came nearly a decade after Russia interfered in the 2016 election to Mr. Trump's benefit, but then saw Mr. Trump adopt few Russia-friendly policies during his first presidency. It's time to pay us back. That's where this idea came from. The Russians want to be paid back for their aid to Trump. Trump gets the idea, oh, well, then we should be getting paid for helping Ukraine, which we're not going to do anymore. Tuesday's meeting in Saudi Arabia was the latest sign that Mr. Trump's second term could be different. In Europe and Ukraine, apprehensions are likely to deepen that the United States and Russia could try to strike their own peace deal, sidelining Kyiv and American allies. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine reacted angrily to Tuesday's meeting, saying he was postponing his own planned visit to Saudi Arabia. He had a plan to arrive on Wednesday, in fact, and he'll be delaying that to protest that Ukraine had not been invited to Tuesday's talks. It was important, he said, that negotiations do not happen behind the backs of the key subjects. Any decisions, he added, cannot be imposed on Ukraine. The meeting came less than a week after Mr. Trump's lengthy phone call with Mr. Putin and took place at a palace in Riyadh, perfect for Trumpy guys, the capital of Saudi Arabia, whose crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman Bonsaws, has been seeking to elevate his country's role on the world stage. Michael Waltz, Mr. Trump's national security advisor, and Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy and longtime friend of Mr. Trump, joined Mr. Rubio for the meeting. Mr. Witkoff called the meeting positive, upbeat, constructive. The Russian delegation included Yuri Ushakov, Mr. Putin's foreign policy advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. Wow. Of course, they're going to be there. Speaking to Russian television, Mr. Dmitriev described a jovial atmosphere. There were a lot of jokes. I don't know what he really sounds like, and a very tasty lunch. While Mr. Ushakov said that both sides also discussed preparations for a meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. He offered no details on when a summit might take place, but I'll tell you, 2 weeks or some other very short period of time. Thank you. Russia appeared to be using Tuesday's talks to cater to Mr. Trump's interest in profits and natural resources, arguing that American oil companies and others stood to gain hundreds of billions of dollars again by doing business in Russia. Mr. Dmitriev, who worked with Mr. Witkoff to broker the release last week of an American school teacher jailed in Russia, so trade the school teacher for political union, said he would seek to restart economic cooperation with the United States to, quote, rebuild communication, rebuild trust, rebuild success. U.S. oil majors have had very successful business in Russia, Mr. Dmitriev said in a brief interview on Tuesday before the talks began, offering an example of how the countries could rebuild business ties. We believe at some point they will be coming back, because why would they forego these opportunities that Russia gave them to have access to Russian natural resources? Russian commentators have expressed the hope that talks with the Trump administration and a peace deal in Ukraine could pave the way for the United States to lift the severe sanctions imposed by the Biden administration and Obama administration against Moscow. Leading Western oil companies, including ExxonMobil, joined many other businesses in pulling out of Russia 3 years ago amid outrage over Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Dmitriev said he would present the American delegation with an estimate showing that American companies lost $300 billion by leaving Russia. Speaking to reporters after Tuesday's meeting, Mr. Rubio described a 3-step plan for what the United States and Russia plan to do next. First, he said, both countries would negotiate how to remove restrictions placed on each other's embassies in Moscow and Washington, which are operating with skeleton staffs after years of tit-for-tat expulsions. I thought we were cutting government staff. Oh, well. In addition, he said, the United States would engage with Russia about parameters of what an end to the Ukraine war would look like. There's going to be engagement and consultation with Ukraine, with our partners in Europe and others, Mr. Rubio said, but ultimately the Russian side will be indispensable to this effort. They're the ones prosecuting the war. If you can get them to agree to stop, then yes, sure. And finally, he said Russia and the United States would explore new partnerships, both in geopolitics and in business. He described them as the extraordinary opportunities that exist should this conflict come to an acceptable end. Tuesday's discussions were the first time after Mr. Putin's invasion in early 2022 that broad delegations of senior American and Russian officials are known to have met in person. In Europe and Ukraine, the news of Tuesday's talks had been met with confusion and concern. Confusion, I was going to say fear, but it's as concern. While Mr. Rubio characterized the talks as preliminary, there was widespread criticism in Europe that Mr. Trump's approach to Russia had not been coordinated with allies of the United States. But for Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed, hosting the talks has offered a major opportunity to solidify his status as a global leader with influence that extends beyond the Middle East. The Saudis, in a foreign ministry statement, said that they were welcoming the Russians and Americans as part of the kingdom's efforts to enhance security and peace in the world. Like other countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has avoided taking sides in the Ukraine war. It has sent humanitarian aid to Ukraine while cultivating close ties with Russia. When a Ukraine peace conference was held in Switzerland last June that excluded Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the neighboring United Arab Emirates refused to sign the final joint statement. I don't know whether their signatures were actually key to a statement like that, but they did refuse to do it, according to this article. So, wow, giving it all away. But, well, we told you first, political union with Russia to own the globalists. It's working, and it's working great. Here's another little something that I have had sitting in pocket for some time that I thought would make great background. Really, probably we've already guessed at a lot of it, but it was set down in well thought out fashion, of course, by Mark Sumner, Devil's Tower. You may also be following on Blue Sky these days, and over at Uncharted Blue, where many of the former front pagers of Daily Kos have absconded off to bring you their long form writing. But Mark wrote this on Blue Sky back on February 12th, which seems ages ago, but isn't. A quick, or as he says, relatively quick look at what Musk's DOGE team is likely doing as they move from one department to another, including why they can appear to produce instant results and why those results often fall apart on closer examination. Well, his take on it, at least back on February 12th, was that, first of all, what they are not doing is reading the code. And we don't mean here the Code of Federal Regulations. We mean the computer coding that they are supposedly examining and updating or having read-only access to, or depending on who you ask, on what day and in what context, what they're actually doing. They're not reading through the code. These are large systems with tens or hundreds of thousands of lines. Some of them are decades old. They're going to be written in C++, C++, C. There's another one here that I don't even know what this does. This look like C and then the pound sign. So C programmers, can you tell me what is that? C sharp, like it would be in music? C something else? I don't know. But also Visual Basic, Ada, I guess, ADA, COBOL, that one I've heard of, etc. No one can just walk in and parse it like reading a book. Each of these systems, depending on when it was written, is going to be structured in a different way. Programming philosophy has changed enormously over time, but many are likely broken into three parts: the interface that users see, the core logic, and the underlying database. That database is where the muskrats will go first. The base of the database is simply tables that contain the raw data, names, addresses, transactions, etc. But DOGE will probably ignore those as well. They'll be looking at something called views. Views are a convenience feature that allows the simple tables to be stitched together into something very like a spreadsheet. For example, a view might tack a name, address, and other features of a transaction together so that they can all be seen together without having to look at many tables. With few exceptions, programmers can't write data to these views, but putting all the logic of how they are stitched together in the database layer means programmers don't have to reproduce that logic whenever they need to display data that's spread over multiple tables. Musk's team will be pulling those views and dumping them into generic data analysis tools. Then they can search for terms like Gaza or DEI in hopes of finding something juicy. However, because they still have only part of the picture, and key to making use of the data properly may actually be hidden in code at the core logic or user interface layers, they're going to jump on a lot of items that are just red herrings. They don't really understand what they are seeing. And that explains quite a lot of what we ended up seeing about, one, the discovery of USAID projects in Gaza, but not Gaza, Palestine, but Gaza, Mozambique. And various other things that they found, including orders that we heard about yesterday to destroy materials at OSHA because they included the word diverse or diversity. No understanding of what they're seeing, just quick searches of the databases and not much else. Mark's also got a piece over here with a deeper look at USAID and what's going on there, or what went on there, which he did post over at Uncharted Blue under the title, Elon Musk may be conducting the bloodiest cover-up in human history. What's going on? Why USAID, I guess, is the thrust of this one. Destroying USAID and firing the agency's inspector general appears to be a pure cover-up of Musk's illegal actions in conducting a foreign policy that included negotiating with an authoritarian dictator, Putin, and betraying a U.S. ally in a time of war. Oh no. This too, written on February 12th, and he likely had these two thoughts in mind as he was working through these things. If it's not already obvious, what Elon Musk and his cadre of testicular twits, oh my, are doing has no relation to saving money for the United States. Everything that the unelected leader of the nation has been doing this past month has only one beneficiary, himself. And there is growing evidence that Musk is willing to kill people if that's what it takes to ensure his power. A lot of people. Just not directly, I guess. The DOGE boys have produced a report showing huge potential issues in government payments. Usually these red herring things that we were talking about before. Musk has been waving this around to justify his actions in between taking his too busy for names, just using letters, kids, for playtime in the Oval Office. However, a cursory glance at the report shows two things. First, it was prepared by the Government Accountability Office under President Joe Biden, so probably not making those mistakes about Gaza. And second, the payments the report identifies are potential false claims made to Medicare, Medicaid, and unemployment insurance, exactly none of which have been the subject of Musk's team's work. So, what the hell is Musk doing using this report to shut down USAID? Well, funny story. Remember the Starlink terminals that were sent to Ukraine? Musk has been taking credit for these terminals for 3 years. There's an embedded tweet here that does just that, which reads, a major factor for why Ukraine was not overrun by Russia is the Starlink support I provided at great risk to SpaceX cyber and physical attack by Russian military forces. Starlink is the backbone of Ukrainian military communications at the front lines because everything else has been blown up or jammed by Russia. In the words of President Zelensky, he embeds a tweet from him saying, and Vice PM of Ukraine confirms that I am an ally, and embedding one of his tweets as well. It turns out, Mark returns to us here, not only did Musk personally turn off Starlink to protect Russian occupiers at the exact moment that Ukraine was depending on this system for use in a counterattack, but those terminals were actually purchased for Ukraine. They didn't give them to him. They were purchased for Ukraine by USAID. Kind of important and kind of being left out on all this. Links provided, of course, that did Musk personally turn off the Starlink to protect Russian occupiers? Yes, according to this BBC News article that is here and linked. What about the USAID funds being used to purchase Starlink? Here, linked to the work of the New Republic. As Forbes reported last week, the agency's, quote, most significant partnership, unquote, was in working with SpaceX to send 5,000 Starlink terminals worth some $3 million to Ukraine for free, at least in terms of the Ukrainians having to pay for them, shortly after the war broke out in 2022. So, why would Musk choose to start his purge of government services with an agency that has been cutting him paychecks? It seems to be directly connected to this announcement, also herein linked, that came from USAID's Office of the Inspector General last May. Quoting from that release, the announcement, the USAID Office of Inspector General, Inspections and Evaluations Division, is initiating an inspection of USAID's oversight of Starlink satellite terminals provided to the government of Ukraine. Why would USAID be looking into these Starlink terminals? Because it appears that not all of them paid for $3 million. Not all of them ended up in Ukraine. As the Kyiv Independent reports, Russian forces have also been mysteriously equipped with Starlink through, quote, shadowy supply chains. Oddly enough, Elon did not turn their service off when Russian forces used those terminals to attack and capture a critical Ukrainian city that had held out against brutal assaults for months. The proliferation of Starlink terminals among Russian frontline troops has contributed to Moscow's recent battlefield gains, the news outlet reported, including the occupation of Vuhledar. I'm hoping I'm even close to pronunciation that's correct there. Vuhledar, Vuhledar, in the Donetsk Oblast. Okay. Those reports came directly from Ukrainian soldiers and officers on the front lines. What was the result of the Inspector General's investigation into Starlink terminals? We may never be sure. Not only has Musk done everything he can to bury USAID, feed it into the wood chipper, etc., right? But loyal flunky Donald Trump fired USAID Inspector General Paul Martin less than a day after Martin produced a report warning that Musk's interference with the agency had left almost $500 million worth of food simply rotting in storage. Firing Martin only doubled down on a move from Trump's first week in office when inspectors general were fired from more than a dozen agencies. Firing all of the inspectors general, that is, may seem like just a part of Trump's Making Corruption Great Again program, like ending prosecution of Eric Adams for bribery or pardoning Rod Blagojevich for attempting to sell a Senate seat, or telling corporations that it's now legal to bribe foreign governments and ending all efforts to prevent foreign interference in U.S. politics. All linked, of course. And yes, the open season on giving and taking all bribes seemed to be baked into Trump's plans to turn the White House into a profit center. But destroying USAID and firing the agency's inspector general appears to be a pure cover-up of Musk's illegal actions in conducting a foreign policy that included negotiating with an authoritarian dictator and betraying a U.S. ally in time of war. The price of Musk destroying an agency to disguise his actual role in Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is already being measured in human lives. One example here, a 71-year-old woman reported in the UK's Telegraph. 71-year-old woman has died after her oxygen supply was cut off when the United States announced a freeze on aid funding. She is thought to be one of the first people to have died as a direct result of Washington's decision to freeze all funding for aid projects for 90 days. Apparently her source of the oxygen, USAID funded. That first death will soon be followed by hundreds, thousands, or even millions as food and healthcare, vital in many regions, go straight into landfills. USAID not only provided for those in need, it helped prevent the spread of disease that could form the next pandemic. It opened doors for U.S. diplomats in areas that might otherwise have remained closed. It provided opportunities for U.S. companies that could piggyback on waves of goodwill. It provided a crucial market for U.S. farmers who depend on sales to the agency. It even helped keep American soldiers safe in the field. All of that is being shredded, and it seems entirely possible that the reason is simply that Musk doesn't want you to know that he's been helping Vladimir Putin murder Ukrainians in their homes. And hell, you already knew that. Not only is the destruction of USAID a knife in the eye of nations and individuals who are foolish enough to believe that the United States could be counted on to keep its promises, it's an enormous gift to China and to Russia, both of whom will rush to expand their spheres of influence and ride the tide of America hate. For Musk, that's just a bonus. And here is a new contribution to the federal firings files. The National Science Foundation, according to Wired magazine, fired 168 workers in a new round of federal purges. Firings at the NSF included permanent employees who had already completed their one-year probationary period, as well as at-will workers. There are different categories of workers in all federal agencies. Wait till you hear this one. This one sounds really interesting, to say the least. Kim Zeder is a reporter for Wired. The National Science Foundation fired nearly 170 workers on a Zoom call on Tuesday morning as part of the Trump administration's agenda to reduce the federal workforce. The terminated workers, who were told their employment would end at 5 p.m. EST today, that is now yesterday, of course, included those still under probation, but also workers who had already completed the requisite one-year probationary period to become permanent workers, and at-will workers who were considered permanent employees. There are an awful lot of different categories there, but just to sort of set the scene for you, remember, this is now Wednesday, but for me, it's Tuesday, as I'm reading you this story from Tuesday saying that these people are going to be fired in a few hours from now. It's still Tuesday as I'm reading you this. You're hearing it on Wednesday. They had a Zoom call, a notice in their email, 9 a.m., come to a 10 a.m. Zoom call. You're all fired as of 5 p.m. today. Earlier this month, the permanent workers who were suddenly told that their one-year probationary period should have been 2 years, and now they are no longer safe from being terminated. How do you like that for a turn of events? People were all hired and told, after 1 year, you become a permanent employee. You're no longer in your probationary period, and you receive all the civil service protections that people working for the government have had for decades, right? But now, no. Oh, we meant 2 years. Apparently, there's really something to it, too, and it's really odd, to say the least. The Trump administration has ordered federal agencies to fire nearly all probationary employees in every department who had not yet gained permanent status, thereby receiving civil service protections. But NSF workers who believed that they were safe suddenly found themselves without jobs today. The National Science Foundation is an independent agency within the federal government that provides grants to universities and other bodies in support of scientific and engineering research. The foundation's grants account for about a quarter of all federal support to academic institutions for research. NSF's grants were paused in late January due to a funding freeze, but the agency resumed issuing grants following a court order earlier this month. Many of the people terminated on Tuesday work as program managers and experts who make decisions about funding by aligning research proposals with the right program and matching those proposals to the most qualified reviewers to assess them and make recommendations. And a quote here from one of the fired employees: "It's hard to imagine this being accomplished successfully with automated algorithms," one fired program manager told Wired. And there's no mention in here, but I guess everybody sort of thinks that the DOGE folks are so high on the AI supply, as it were. That must be what they have in mind. Hard to imagine that being done successfully, this person says. With fewer program officers to steward the evaluation process, the overwhelming concern is that it will become harder to identify and support the transformative but unconventional projects that could otherwise be game changers in terms of advancing scientific progress in the USA. And then, of course, what if your AI has a programming line deep inside that says, oh, SpaceX benefits from this? Approve the grant. Who knows whether we'll find that out or not. All sources who spoke with Wired, of course, requested anonymity for fear of retribution. Sources say 168 workers received an email at 9:02 a.m. EST this morning requesting their presence at a 10 a.m. Zoom call for a, quote, meeting with NSF probationary employees. This, of course, being Tuesday morning. Many workers did not receive the Zoom link in their email, apparently, and missed the start of the call. At the meeting, they were told that their network access would be shut out at 1 p.m., and they had until 5 p.m. to clear out their desks. Although, very kindly, they said workers were told that accommodations could be made to obtain things that they weren't able to clear out by 5 p.m. The termination action this morning also included all permanent employees who were designated as at-will workers. One terminated worker tells Wired that they were a permanent federal employee working on a part-time basis with an annual contract that was up for renewal in September. The decision to terminate at-will employees came from NSF alone, not from the administration, NSF management told workers during the meeting. When asked whether at-will employees were just terminated out of fairness to the probationary workers, NSF management replied that the decision was partly due to fairness, but that's not all. That was the quote. The source said management then indicated that this was just the first step in subsequent termination rounds. The workers said that they understood from this that the NSF believed at-will workers would be targeted in a subsequent round anyway, so they decided to terminate those workers now as well. The fired program manager who spoke to Wired came to NSF from academia on a temporary rotation position. Rotationary workers are those who work for a university but spend some of their time working for the NSF for a specific period. When a permanent position suddenly opened up during the worker's rotation, NSF asked the worker to apply for it. They were hired in the summer of 2023 as a program manager with a 1-year trial period that ended in the summer of 2024. Paperwork that the worker shared with Wired showed that the worker became a permanent employee at that time. But the worker says they and others were suddenly told recently, I imagine like right now, that NSF had made a mistake. During the Tuesday Zoom call, the worker says staff from NSF Human Resources seemed to indicate that they had been caught off guard by the decision. They were watching their words carefully, the worker says. My sense is that they were caught unawares and probably somebody pointed to some federal statute somewhere that made them rethink how they had been doing things in the past. The program manager says management and HR personnel told workers on the call that they believed the foundation had discretion to decide the probationary period, but were recently told that the foundation did not have that discretion and that the probationary period should have been 2 years for all workers. I'd hate to find that out. Wow. Not everyone still on that probationary period got fired on Tuesday. The source tells Wired some workers who were very close to completing 2 years were, I guess thankfully not, included in the terminations today, but workers were told that today's action was just the first in what will be other termination actions at the foundation. There were exceptions made for people who were very close to completing their 2-year period, this worker says. The temporary rotation worker and other workers at NSF were told in January that they could accept that so-called fork-in-the-road resignation deal that would have allowed them to continue to draw salary through September if they resigned their positions. But the worker says that because he had completed his probationary period, he believed his job was safe. Once they were told that the probationary period was in question, he had only a couple of days to decide about the buyout, but the union had advised workers not to take it. So now, he says, his life and the lives of other workers have been thrown into chaos. And they would have been in chaos had they accepted the buyout anyway, since nobody knows whether those things are legal. They didn't say that in the piece, but that's to be considered as well. The at-will worker says that during a question and answer portion of the Zoom call, several workers brought up the fact that federal agencies were supposed to condition the terminations based on merit, by law, but this didn't seem to be happening. Workers have been receiving termination letters from the Office of Personnel Management saying that the government has determined that they or their position no longer has value to the government. Wow, that's nice. There were a number of employees who commented that they had nothing but exemplary performance reviews and director awards for meritorious services. So this notion that they were being let go for poor performance was ludicrous, they said. The answer was that they were simply copying the verbiage from OPM and that their value to the nation is no longer required. So basically, because they read somewhere in the statutes, and I'm amazed they read the statutes, the DOGE, whoever, people who are handling the firings, found out, well, we can fire people for poor performance at the end of their probationary period. So do that. Well, how do we know that their performance was poor? In fact, many of these people have a tremendous amount of evidence on their side that their service has been exemplary. Yes, but if you put in the letter that it was poor, that's the end of the inquiry. They can go and try and mediate their firing, but they're going to end up standing there with a letter that says they were fired for poor performance. They'll say they weren't, but that's kind of what everybody says. Put it in the letter. So they put it in the letter. Yeah. So that reminds me, there's another thing sitting around here in Pocket that I've been waiting on. Let me see if I can find the right one, but having to do with these folks who are getting dismissed and dismissed for reasons that ordinarily wouldn't stand up in court. But I guess Pocket doesn't really want to open anything anymore. So I guess that's it. There won't be any more stories. No, here it is finally. It took its sweet time here. Marissa Cabas, once again, who's really was one of the prime movers in the first rounds of these stories, has another interesting observation here. Let me start with her earlier post on Blue Sky that probably must have been like early February, that she reproduces and then comments further on back on February 11th. She first, though, begins with a statement or a post 6 days earlier than that. It can't be a coincidence that the CFPB email firing probationary employees included the language below. As I reported earlier, one of three members. Okay, well, let me. I guess I don't want to spoil it. This is the interesting part. So here's the language that was included in the emails firing probationary employees at CFPB. If you believe this action, remember, they're all getting things that say, yeah, you're a probationary employee. You're now being fired for poor performance. If you believe this action is being taken based on partisan political reasons or marital status, interesting, you have the right to file an appeal with the Merit Systems Protection Board, or MSPB, under 5 Code of Federal Regulations, Title 315.806. You must file an appeal within 30 days of the effective date of this decision, or 30 days after the date of your receipt of this decision, whichever is later. You should review MSPB regulations at Title 5 Code of Federal Regulations 88, and then 1201.14, 1201.24 for instructions on how to file an electronic appeal and content requirements of the appeal, respectively. For more information, please visit the website mspb.gov or contact your local MSPB regional or field office. Right? So those are your rights. If you have been performing admirably and in fact exceptionally, been cited for excellence by the director, and you found out, oh, I'm being terminated for poor performance, I have the right to take this to the Merit Systems Protection Board. Meritocracy, right? None of this DEI stuff. We're going to be a meritocracy now, and I merit permanent employment, and yet they say I don't. Well, I'm going to the MSPB. There's a whole board here about merit systems. Well, Marissa reminds us, as I reported earlier, one of 3 members of this board, the MSPB, was also fired. Wow, what do you know? If they fire one more, they will lack a quorum to actually hear any cases. Isn't that something? What a great backhanded way well, you're fired, but you're fired for poor performance. And we're lying about the poor performance, but you have the right to appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board. But we fired the Merit Systems Protection Board, so I guess, I don't know what comes out of it. I guess you're all gone. Bye. Then Marissa updates this thing a couple days later to put a finer point on it. She says the Trump administration is mass firing federal employees and telling them that if they dispute their termination, they can take it up with a board that will lack a quorum to function as of March 1st. We now learn when another of the current board members' terms expires. So they fired two. Or what was it? One of the three members? One of the members of the board was fired. There's three members on the board. One was fired. There's two on the board. That's still a quorum. Why didn't they fire two? Just to make sure that nobody would be able to talk to the Merit Systems Protection Board? Well, as it turns out, one of the terms expires on March 1st anyway. So there won't be a quorum in, what are we talking about? 10 days. Now, I guess that still leaves people an opportunity to file before they lose their quorum, but I guess they're probably not likely to get to any of those cases in time to do anything. How do you like that? That's an interesting twist. Now, what if I told you that I was going to bore you to death with a very long read from Steve Vladek that will be touching on all of these things? You would probably turn off the show, but don't do that. So let me tell you what's going on and what Steve Vladek is pointing at. There is a case rapidly making its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court. Where's my sound effects? I need some sort of, the dramatic music. What kind of court? The Supreme kind. What's going on? It is, of course, about one of these Trump firings. And it's an important one. And it's confusing, and it's got about 5 or 6 different weird layers. And Steve Vladek is warning you, though this thing will be moving very quickly, there will be a decision, I think, relatively quickly. The warning is, don't read too much into it. There's an awful lot going on here, no matter which way it goes. There's every opportunity that this will go against the Trump administration in this firing, but that it won't be broadly or generally applicable to other firings. And here's how you know. Steve Vladek says so. There you go. Long story short. You ready for the details? This is an excellent use of a taped show. It's Steve Vladek's Substack. And the title here, The Court's First Trump 2 Case, Trump 2, second term, won't be a bellwether. Well, I told you that part, but okay. The challenge to Trump's removal of the head of the Office of Special Counsel. You might think you know who we're talking about, but it's not Jack Smith. Different kind of special counsel. Raises unique procedural and substantive issues likely to prevent it from serving as a referendum in either direction. All right. Here's the deal. This was written on Monday, the 17th, and he begins by saying yesterday afternoon, Sunday, the first of the dozens of lawsuits challenging actions taken by President Trump and his administration over the past 4 weeks, yes, it's only been 4 weeks, reached the Supreme Court. Already there. In Besant v. Dellinger, the acting Solicitor General, yeah, which kind? Right, the acting Solicitor General, or the unacceptable Solicitor General. He's also unacceptable, but he's the acting Solicitor General on behalf of the Department of Justice, is now asking the Supreme Court to vacate a D.C. federal judge's ruling, the judge, you'll hear her name in a minute, that had temporarily reinstated Hampton Dellinger, what a name, huh? Hampton Dellinger as the head of the Office of Special Counsel, an independent federal agency. The government is also asking the court to issue an immediate administrative stay to pause that ruling and keep Dellinger out of office, a request that neither Chief Justice Roberts, who as the circuit justice for the D.C. Circuit received the request, nor the full court have yet to act on. All right, so nobody's done anything yet, but they've been asked for an an immediate administrative stay. The trial level judge said this doesn't hold water, reinstates Dellinger. The government intervenes, goes directly to the Supreme Court and says, you got to put an administrative stay on the ruling so that we can force Dellinger back out or keep him out, depending on where he actually is physically. It's easy to understand why folks will see the Dellinger case as a litmus test for the justices and will assume that however the court rules on the government's emergency application here will necessarily signal how much or how little the justices are going to push back against the rest of the new administration's actions. My own view, though, and after reviewing this, I have to admit this is a point well taken, and it will prepare you well for the results, although you will see everybody around you screaming the opposite. You may or may not want to be... you may or may not want to explain it to him. You may not be able to explain it to him. It might be beyond our abilities, but you can point him to this article. So what's going on? Steve says, my own view is that this is almost certainly a mistake to think of it as a bellwether in both directions. The Dellinger case raises unique procedural obstacles that could foreclose emergency relief to the government, right? They'll lose without signaling any view of the merits, i.e. whether or not you're allowed to make this firing. Wait till you hear how it happens. But it also raises a constitutional argument in support of Trump's conduct that is stronger in this context than it will be in almost any of the other pending cases. You're really not going to be able to make much of this one. The Dellinger case is important in its own right, but no matter how the court rules, we shouldn't view the result as foreshadowing everything, or frankly, almost anything else that's coming. Here's how it's going to work. To understand why the Dellinger case is unique, it's necessary to provide some background on the agency at issue, the constitutional defense of Trump's conduct, and the procedural posture of the litigation to date, how it came to the court. Why? What are the questions? First, the OSC, the Office of Special Counsel, and the unitary executive. Right. Well, first of all, what's going on here with the OSC? The Office of Special Counsel has nothing to do with the more famous special counsels, those enclosed in quotes here, within the Department of Justice, like Jack Smith. Rather, this one, OSC, is an autonomous, independent agency within the executive branch, initially created by Congress in the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 as part of the Merit Systems Protection Board. That's why I'm here. And then it was given its own legal footing as a standalone agency in the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989. OSC's charge is to protect federal employees from unlawful employment-related conduct by the federal government. That is, what they call prohibited personnel practices, including, but not limited to, retaliation against whistleblowers. To that end, OSC is the central office within the executive branch tasked with investigating and pursuing federal employees' claims of wrongful employment practices. You said I was a great employee. You terminated me for poor performance. Yes, but you're a probationary. Yes, but you said it was 1 year. Yes, but we meant 2. Right? That's who's going to get these cases. Indeed, Congress created OSC at least largely as an alternative to authorizing employment-related litigation by government employees against the government. They didn't want everybody just suing all at once. They wanted to have a clearinghouse that would just deal with the whole thing, and not every employee who gets mad suing their independent or their individual agency, and every agency of the government constantly in court. Send it all to OSC. Let them handle it. They'll be issue area experts. So the idea was that instead of opening the litigation floodgates, OSC would clean up the government's employment-related dirty laundry. The head of OSC is the special counsel of the United States, who, by statute, is appointed by the president with the Senate's advice and consent to a 5-year term and can be removed by the president, but only, and this is the quote, only for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office, unquote. In March of 2024, so about a year ago, with the Senate's consent, President Biden appointed Hampton Dellinger as the special counsel. Then, 10 days ago, on February 7th, now 12 days ago, President Trump purported to, thank you very much, thanks, Steve, purported to dismiss Dellinger, although he did not identify any, quote, inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office that would justify Dellinger's removal. Similar problem in that sense, right? Instead, Dellinger's removal was apparently predicated on the view that the for-cause removal restrictions in the Civil Service Reform Act, that is, you can only remove people for a cause, those protections, the claim is that's unconstitutional. Now, after and in light of the Supreme Court's decisions in 2 previous recent cases, is this SEILA law, S-E-I-L-A? I'm not familiar with the case. SEILA law versus CFPB in 2020, and the case of Collins versus Yellen in 2021. Well, to make a very long story a bit shorter, Steve says, Congress's long asserted power to protect certain executive branch officers from at-will removal has long been a bête noire for conservatives, especially those who subscribe to the unitary executive theory of Article 2. And how do you even say that in French? Is it bête noire? I don't know. But you get the idea. They don't like it, especially those who subscribe to the unitary executive theory of Article 2, which is stupid, but there are many people who subscribe to it, and it's among the things we are told we were pretty wrong about. The Supreme Court has upheld for-cause removal restrictions for multi-member heads of independent agencies like the FTC and for inferior officers like the independent counsel created by the Ethics in Government Act of 1978. But both of these precedents, the cases being, if you're at all familiar with them, I don't know. If you're a constitutional lawyer, you already know this, I guess. But Humphrey's Executor versus the United States for the FTC case, or the multi-member heads of independent agencies, and then the independent counsel case, Morrison v. Olson. That one I remember. Well, anyway, both of those precedents are despised, especially among certainly among conservatives, not everywhere else necessarily. But in this case, they have been critically taught in con law for long enough that they are not just despised by the justices appointed by Republican presidents. They haven't been overruled yet, but they have been heavily narrowed, especially in SEILA law and Collins. But of those cases, or rather both of those cases, held that removal restrictions that Congress had imposed upon the head of an executive branch agency with a single director were unconstitutional. In SEILA law, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, that's the agency we're talking about with a single director, and in Collins, it was the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Now, against that backdrop, there is an obvious argument that the for-cause removal protections applicable to the special counsel are also unconstitutional. He's the single head, right? Indeed, there may well be not just 5 votes on the current Supreme Court for that conclusion, but maybe as many as 7 or even 8. You know, people have been looking askance at these single agency heads that can't be removed at will by the president as the unitary executive theory gains ascendancy. But there are also substantial grounds on which OSC, the special counsel, could be distinguished from the CFPB and the FHFA. Indeed, the majority opinion in CILA law itself distinguished the Office of Special Counsel. They actually discussed this. Is the Office of Special Counsel like these two? Well, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Especially because one of the most important purposes of the Office of Special Counsel is to provide a mechanism for federal employees to challenge employment-related actions by political appointees. So it's kind of different, right? And you can see what a problem it is to find out that, you've just dismissed or retired 2/3 of the Merit Systems Protection Board that you're allowed to go to if you think you've been fired for political reasons. And the OSC can be of no help to you either unless we differentiate the Office of the Special Counsel from other single head agencies. Not only does OSC thus wield a very different kind of power than CFPB or FHFA, but if OSC 2 had to be headed by a political appointee, you're going to dismiss the 5-year term person and put in a political appointee instead. Well, then the OSC would be limited to considering employment claims against, rogue executive branch supervisors, rather than challenges to conduct that is sanctioned directly or indirectly by relevant agencies' leaders. Of course, that's a policy argument for distinguishing CILA law and Collins, but as will become important in a moment, it's hardly a frivolous argument, as recent events underscore. Thus, were the question only whether the Supreme Court is going to uphold the statute that Trump violated when he fired Dellinger, the answer might quite likely be no. They would say, it's a single head agency just like CFPB and FHFA, so you're out of here. But the court isn't deciding only that question. It is deciding whether to grant emergency relief in a context in which the Court of Appeals held that it didn't even have jurisdiction to hear the government's appeal. And that complicates things. On to a next section here, the non-appealability of temporary restraining orders. One of the differences between TROs and everything else. In federal courts and many state courts, a litigant who needs immediate relief will typically seek a preliminary injunction to stop the defendant from continuing to take allegedly unlawful action while the case unfolds. And if that's not immediate enough, the litigant may seek a temporary restraining order, the TROs. We're hearing a lot about those these days, which is meant to be a more expeditious mechanism for providing urgent relief in exchange for being limited in duration to 14 days. One of the biggest differences between a TRO and a preliminary injunction is that the former is not, in most cases, immediately appealable, whereas the latter, the preliminary injunction, is. This has been a matter of some debate for decades, but the consensus has long been that it would cause chaos if grants or denials of TROs were immediately appealable. I think you can see why, but we'll explain. Since many TROs are entered without the other party even being present, for one thing, even more of them are accompanied by proceedings that are more truncated than what precedes a grant or denial of a preliminary injunction. So there's less record to be reviewed in an appeal. Makes it very tough. And in any event, the federal rules, anyway, limit a TRO's duration so that by the time, this is probably the one you guessed, by the time the appeal can be fully resolved, the TRO may not even be in effect anymore, and all the harm suffered by the recipient may be brief in duration anyhow. So, yeah, by the time they get around to litigating appeals on a 14-day temporary restraining order, the whole thing's moot. Courts have recognized, though, two contexts in which temporary restraining orders can, nevertheless, be directly and immediately reviewed by appellate courts, even on a weekend. First, in cases in which the TRO is clearly an abuse of the district court's authority, appellate courts have granted writs of mandamus, you remember them, to wipe them away. A writ of mandamus, an order from a higher court to either to a lower court or some civil authority just commanding that a certain job be done or document be signed or whatever it is that's necessary to carry out the law. We order you to do this specific thing, a writ of mandamus. Anyway, so that is available to you if the appellate courts find that the district court just clearly abused its authority, relying upon the All Writs Act for the proposition that they can issue extraordinary relief in cases in which the lower court's error was indisputably clear and causing irreparable harm. Sounds fair. Second, the second such instance, as Sixth Circuit Chief Judge Jeff Sutton has put it, a TRO may also be appealable when it is, in effect, a litigation-altering and litigation-ending injunction because it gives the parties no meaningful appellate options about a significant issue of law given the imminence of an irreversible event, say an execution, that would be irreversible, or an election, which at least one party to some of these cases thinks is reversible. But hey, the rest of us don't think so. Neither of these contexts, though, is present here in the OSC case. With respect to mandamus, even if the Supreme Court is likely to strike down for-cause removal protections in the OSC statute, it hasn't yet. And, as noted above, there are plausible grounds on which the most on-point precedents could have been, the on-point precedents being CFPB and FHFA, could have been and were, in that case, distinguished. Now, as for the contexts in which TROs have been treated as if they're effectively appealable injunctions, this isn't one of them. The government will be just as able to defend Dellinger's removal if and when the district court soon enough issues a preliminary injunction to follow its TRO, as it is here. Instead, the government's principal argument in the Supreme Court is that this TRO should have been appealable because, one, it's interfering with the president's Article 2 prerogatives, and two, the judge, Amy Berman Jackson, we've heard her name quite a bit, has already all but signaled how she's going to rule on the preliminary injunction. It's not clear, though, why either of those arguments support a new ground, what they're asking for, a new ground for allowing an appeal that has hitherto not been recognized. It's against the rules, essentially, in this situation, to appeal a temporary restraining order. But that's what they're asking the court to do anyway, for no particular reason, which, to short circuit this rest of the story, is why you might find the Supreme Court denying the Trump administration what they're asking for without it meaning that they are going to save anybody's jobs later on, or this guy's job eventually. You see where that's going? Again, if a district court is flagrantly abusing its power through a TRO, mandamus ought to be an adequate remedy. But if the government can't meet the high burden on the merits for a writ of mandamus, and if an appeal after a grant or denial of a preliminary injunction is meaningfully available, as it is here, the government should have to wait to appeal. That's what the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals said on Saturday night, and the Supreme Court shouldn't be able to issue emergency relief unless 5 or more justices believe not only that the government is likely to prevail on the merits, but that the D.C. Circuit's jurisdictional holding was itself incorrect, and the D.C. Circuit upheld the rule on the appealability of TROs. That's not incorrect. That seems a much closer call to me, Steve Vladek, than the number of votes on the SELA law or Collins issues. Now, Why won't the Dellinger case ruling be a referendum? To be sure, the Trump administration has fired thousands of federal employees in ways that are being challenged on various statutory and constitutional grounds. But of all these cases, Dellinger's is at the extreme end of the spectrum with respect to the strength of the government's position on the merits. For Dellinger is, or was, the head of an agency. This is almost certainly why the government has moved so aggressively in this case, and why the acting Solicitor General was so intent on taking this issue to the court in this premature posture. Unlike in so many of the other suits challenging the new administration's conduct, the government knows it's playing a relatively stronger hand. That's why, even if this court uses this opportunity to make clear that all executive branch agency heads, or even all single agency heads, must serve at the president's pleasure, that would tell us nothing about lower level officers within the federal agencies, or even more importantly, non-officer employees protected from summary or arbitrary termination by the Civil Service Reform Act and other statutes. In other words, even within the employment context alone, this case is a massive outlier. Certainly, if the court were to deny emergency relief because it believes Dellinger is going to win, the least likely outcome, in my view, that would put an awful lot of force behind those other employment-related challenges. But the inverse just doesn't follow. There will be plenty of viable legal challenges to how Trump is trying to eviscerate the federal bureaucracy, no matter what the Supreme Court does here. Likewise, this case has nothing to do with any of the funding or spending-related litigation rapidly working its way through the Supreme Court. As I noted 2 weeks ago, and links to it to prove it, even the most ardent zealots of the unitary executive theory have not viewed that understanding as extending to a unilateral presidential power to impound federal funds. Likewise, the unitary executive theory has exceedingly little to do with statutory and constitutional limits on the federal government's power to impose conditions on the recipients of federal funds. Those cases will charge ahead regardless of what happens here, and it's virtually impossible to see how the disposition in Dellinger could affect them. It's not that this case is unimportant. OSC is the federal agency most obviously tasked with protecting the rights of federal employees, which presumably is why kneecapping it is such an important part of the administration's broader effort to hollow out the federal workforce. The point is just that an order from the Supreme Court granting the government's application here is almost certainly going to be good for this train only, and will tell us vanishingly little about all the other cases that are heading for the court sooner rather than later. Folks who try to read into such a ruling that the court is going to side with Trump in all or even most of these cases will, in my view, be making a serious mistake. It's entirely possible that Trump loses most of these cases, but wins this one. And the flip side is also true. If the court denies the government's application, it will almost certainly be on procedural grounds that are specific to the context in which this particular application arose. Not only would I expect the court to say as much, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is the outcome for it to be accompanied by a multiple justice statement respecting the denial that emphasizes how strong the government's case is on the merits, to put a thumb on the scale of what happens in the district court and the D.C. Circuit if this case moves forward. Thus, folks should not take a denial in this case, especially if it's on procedural grounds, as a harbinger of what's coming in the future cases either. I understand why many will be tempted to read into this case some deeper conclusion about where the court is going. The point of this post is to provide reasons why that temptation should be resisted. Very little that the Supreme Court does or says in Dellinger is likely to bear upon what it does or says in the next Trump 2 cases that reach the justices. And those cases will get to the court soon enough. So my own caution, by the way, at the end of this is you may very well be correct that a decision in favor of the Trump administration is a harbinger of more such decisions, because they may very well decide to blow straight past all limitations of law and precedent and just give the president what he wants. But it will be indistinguishable from having done so on different grounds. And it's only when I think no feasible grounds present themselves that I think they'll just skip describing their reasoning and hand down an answer with no reasoning or scattered reasoning. But here I think they can find a way onto solid ground, as he explains, no matter what they do. And so you may be right, and it may end up being the first of many cases in which the law is just totally disregarded. But the record that the case produces won't be useful as evidence for that at this point in time, and won't even be particularly good evidence later on. If they steamroller the law and throw it all out and burn all the books later, this case might not stand with the others. They may say it was an early exception to what became the rule, that there were no rules, because it's very easy to find a rules-based outcome, whichever one they want to choose in this one. So that's all. It's complicated, but you're going to feel smart when it comes down, especially when it comes down and people freak out and start posting on Blue Sky one way or the other about what the case means. You'll say, ha, I'm so very smart. I know this means nothing at all, which will be extraordinarily unhelpful. I recommend that you not do it. But I wanted you to be smart when the decision came down. All right, I have one more piece for you that I think might sum things up nicely today that I've been holding on to for a while from Foreign Policy magazine, dated, it can't be all that long ago, February 11th, but has been waiting its turn. A piece called DOGE, D-O-G-E. DOGE is hacking America. Now, that's a sentiment we've heard or felt a number of times, but this goes into some interesting extra depth, I think, in making this comparison. The U.S. government has experienced, it says, what may be the most consequential security breach in its history. That's just the subheader. We have on the byline here Bruce Schneier, a security technologist and lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Davi, I don't know how he pronounces it, D-A-V-I, but like without the D at the end, my name. And I'm not 100% sure that that's correct or not, but that's the way it's presented. Davi Ottenheimer, Vice President of Trust and Digital Ethics at Inrupt, a data infrastructure company. So you can go and check it out. But here's what they have to say. Ready for this one? Okay. In the span of just a few weeks, the U.S. government has experienced what may be the most consequential security breach in its history, not through a sophisticated cyber attack or an act of foreign espionage, maybe, but through official orders by a billionaire with a poorly defined government role, or possibly no government role at all. We don't know. And the implications for national security are profound. First, it was reported, of course, that people associated with the newly created so-called Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, had accessed the U.S. Treasury computer system, giving them the ability to collect data on and potentially control the department's roughly $5.45 trillion in annual federal payments. We've, of course, heard plenty about that. Then we learned that uncleared DOGE personnel had gained access to classified data from the U.S. Agency for International Development, possibly copying it into their own systems. Next, the Office of Personnel Management, which holds detailed personal data on millions of federal employees, including those with security clearances, was compromised. After that, Medicaid and Medicare records were compromised. And, of course, we got our take on why and how those things were happening from Mark Sumner earlier, plus any number of articles we've read along the way. Meanwhile, only partially redacted names of CIA employees were sent over an unclassified email account. I don't know if we managed to mention that. If we did, perhaps only in passing, but that should have been on your radar screen as well. DOGE personnel are also reported to be feeding education department data into artificial intelligence software, and they have also started working on the Department of Energy. The story is moving very fast. On February 8th, a federal judge blocked the DOGE team from accessing the Treasury Department systems any further. But given that DOGE workers had already copied data and possibly installed and modified software, it's unclear how this fixes anything. In any case, breaches of other critical governmental systems are likely to follow unless federal employees stand firm on the protocols protecting national security. But it's unclear whether they can. The systems that DOGE is accessing are not esoteric pieces of our nation's infrastructure. They are the sinews of government. And there's a link here to something else I think is maybe of some interest for the provenance of the term, sinews of government. That's very specific. Comes from Lawfare Media. Elon Musk weaponizes the government. Perhaps something you want to check out on your own. I may read after the show is done here. For example, the Treasury Department systems. Why is it the sinews of government? The Treasury Department systems contain the technical blueprints for how the federal government moves money, while the Office of Personnel Management network contains information on who and what organizations the government employs and contracts with. What makes this situation unprecedented isn't just the scope, but also the method of attack. Foreign adversaries typically spend years attempting to penetrate government systems such as these, using stealth to avoid being seen and carefully hiding any tells or tracks. The Chinese government's 2015 breach of OPM, did you remember that that's what they tried to break into? Was a significant U.S. security failure, and it illustrated how personnel data could be used to identify intelligence officers and compromise national security. In this case, external operators with limited experience and minimal oversight are doing their work in plain sight and under massive public scrutiny, gaining the highest levels of administrative access and making changes to the United States' most sensitive networks, potentially introducing new security vulnerabilities in the process. But the most alarming aspect isn't just the access being granted, it's the systematic dismantling of security measures that would detect and prevent misuse, including standard incident response protocols, auditing, and change tracking mechanisms, by removing the career officials in charge of those security measures and replacing them with inexperienced operators. The Treasury's computer systems have such an impact on national security that they were designed with the same principle that guides nuclear launch protocols. No single person should have unlimited power, just as launching a nuclear missile requires two separate officers turning their keys simultaneously. Making changes to critical financial systems traditionally requires multiple authorized personnel working in concert. This approach, known as the separation of duties, isn't just bureaucratic red tape. It's a fundamental security principle as old as banking itself. When your local bank processes a large transfer, it requires two different employees to verify the transaction. When a company issues a major financial report, separate teams must review and approve it. These aren't just formalities, they're essential safeguards against corruption and error. These measures have been bypassed or ignored. It's as if someone found a way to rob Fort Knox, as if that wasn't relevant again, to rob Fort Knox by simply declaring that the new official policy is fire all the guards and allow unescorted visits to the vault. And guess what we're going to be doing next week? The implications for national security are staggering. Senator Ron Wyden said his office had learned that the attackers gained privileges that allow them to modify core programs in the Treasury Department computers that verify federal payments, access encrypted keys that secure financial transactions, and alter audit logs that record system changes. You can put in a backdoor and erase the evidence that you put it there. among other things. Over at OPM, reports indicate that individuals associated with DOGE connected an unauthorized server to the network. That's how Mike Flynn got fired from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They are also reporting training AI software on all of this sensitive data. This is much more critical than the initial unauthorized access. These new servers have unknown capabilities and configurations, and there's no evidence that this new code has gone through any rigorous security testing protocols. The AIs being trained are certainly not secure enough for this kind of data. All are ideal targets for any adversary, foreign or domestic, also seeking access to federal data. Hack that if you can't hack the OPM, right? There's a reason why every modification, hardware or software, to these systems goes through a complex planning process and includes sophisticated access control mechanisms. The national security crisis is that these systems are now much more vulnerable to dangerous attacks at the same time that the legitimate system administrators trained to protect them have been locked out. By modifying core systems, the attackers have not only compromised current operations, but have also left behind vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future attacks, giving adversaries such as Russia and China, if they're an adversary anymore, an unprecedented opportunity. These countries have long targeted these systems, and they don't just want to gather intelligence. They also want to understand how to disrupt these systems in a crisis. Like, let's say one day Trump doesn't want to cooperate with Putin anymore. What do? They got him over a barrel. I will erase your treasury. Well, they don't really have to go that far with him. Of course, they can just say, we'll give you $1 million. But okay. Now, the technical details of how these systems operate, their security protocols, and their vulnerabilities are now potentially exposed to unknown parties without any of the usual safeguards. That seems pretty bad. Instead of having to breach heavily fortified digital walls, these parties can simply walk through the doors that are being propped open. Remember when doors were a problem? And then erase the evidence of their actions. The security implications span 3 critical areas. First, system manipulation. I thought that was the end of the article. That was a pretty good end of the article, but this is more. First, system manipulation. External operators can now modify operations while also altering audit trails that would track their changes. Second, data exposure. Beyond accessing the personal information and transaction records, these operators can copy entire system architectures and security configurations. In one case, the technical blueprint of the country's federal payment infrastructure. Third, and most critically, is the issue of system control. These operators can alter core systems and authentication mechanisms while disabling the very tools designed to detect such changes. This is more than modifying operations. It is modifying the infrastructure that those operations use. To address these vulnerabilities, 3 immediate steps are essential, none of which will ever be taken, I'm sure. First, unauthorized access must be revoked and proper authentication protocols restored. Next, comprehensive system monitoring and change management must be reinstated, which, given the difficulty of cleaning a compromised system, will likely require a complete system reset. Finally, thorough audits must be conducted of all system changes made during this period. This is beyond politics. This is a matter of national security. Foreign national intelligence organizations will be quick to take advantage of both the chaos and the new insecurities to steal U.S. data and install backdoors to allow for future access. Each day of continued unrestricted access makes the eventual recovery more difficult and increases the risk of irreversible damage to these critical systems. While the full impact may take time to assess, these steps represent the minimum necessary actions to begin restoring system integrity and security protocols, assuming, of course, that anyone in the government still cares. And I don't think that's a great assumption. Oh well, at least we have a roadmap back if anyone ever discovers it in the pile of nuclear rubble underneath the Statue of Liberty when the apes rule the planet. All right, something else I wanted to add to the pile of things for you to consider. A Michael Tomasky piece for the New Republic from last Friday, Valentine's Day, that I thought was making a good point that we should layer on top of all of the stuff going on in the Eric Adams case and the Emil Bove situation. This basically a reminder of where all of this is coming from, if not directly from Trump, then certainly Pam Bondi, and her name isn't getting mentioned in most of the discussion of this situation, and really ought to be. Trump's AG just did something so corrupt she should be fired already. But she isn't, of course. That's the title of the piece. Note to right-wing media and all you fantasists who believe them, this is what judicial sleaze really looks like. And, well, it goes like this. Pam Bondi, as you know, was approved by the Senate to be Attorney General on February 4th. On February 5th, she was sworn in, and on February 10th, 5 days into her already ghastly tenure, she committed an act so electrically sleazy that in a normally ordered world, she'd be forced from office immediately. Why Bondi? Why is my wrath not limited to Emil Bove, the acting Assistant Attorney General? After all, it was Bove, which he is the one who pointed it out to me, apparently rhymes with no way. Bove, no way. Who wrote the instantly infamous memo ordering Danielle Sassoon, the acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, to dismiss all charges against New York Mayor Eric Adams, quote, as soon as is practicable. Sassoon, of course, quit instead. True enough, Bove's Bond villain name and his broodingly, pharaonic countenance, is that right? Help finger him as an easy bad guy, but read the damn memo. Here's how it starts. You, Sassoon, you are directed as authorized by the Attorney General to dismiss the pending charges in United States v. Adams. As authorized by the Attorney General. There it is. The top law enforcement officer of the United States, 5 days on the job, ordered that corruption charges painstakingly assembled over a multi-year period by prosecutors in New York's Southern District be dismissed. Why? Well, your average fair-minded person, presented with the facts as I've laid them out so far, would assume that said Attorney General and her people had discovered new information that exculpated the mayor. That's how justice works in the movies, right? But not here. In fact, Bove's memo admits the opposite. It reads, the Justice Department has reached this conclusion without assessing the strength of the evidence or the legal theories on which the case is based. Couldn't be clearer. Bondi's decision, and please call it that, Bondi's decision, not Bove's, had nothing to do with the evidence. So what did it have to do with? Two factors. The first is timing. The memo states it cannot be ignored that Mayor Adams criticized the prior administration's immigration policies before the charges were filed. That's a staggering sentence. It assumes an almost casual and universal corruption on the part of prosecutors in the Southern District generally, and the U.S. Attorney in particular. This is an outrageous charge that prosecutors are working to exact political revenge for presidents. That is a morality that Fox News and others have gotten millions of Americans to cynically buy into. It is not the real-life morality of the Southern District, which for decades has rightfully enjoyed an apolitical reputation. Even when there have been politically ambitious U.S. attorneys in charge who are clearly bringing cases that might benefit them politically, most obviously Rudy Giuliani prosecuting corrupt Democratic bosses in the 1980s, it had to be admitted that the prosecutions were legit. Giuliani won convictions in those cases, and the city was better off. But in this accusation, by the nation's top law enforcement officer, that the Southern District is, or was, a priori corrupt, it's the kind of accusation, history instructs us, that is usually made by people who are guilty of exactly that which they allege. And as you know, I believe that every Republican accusation is a confession. And it is an accusation lodged specifically at former U.S. Attorney Damian Williams. Yes, Williams was appointed by Biden. Yes, Williams is a Democrat. But what is his record of politically selective prosecutions? Well, let's see. He oversaw the indictment of former New York Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin, a Democrat, and for what it's worth, like Williams, a black man, I mention this only because the right-wing media would surely claim that the fact is as relevant were it expedient to do so. He oversaw the indictment of Democratic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. In 2018, as an assistant U.S. attorney in the same Southern District, he helped secure the indictment and conviction of Sheldon Silver, the powerful former Speaker of the New York State Assembly, and yes, another fellow Democrat. And bear in mind, of course, that the investigation of Adams stretched back years. Read the indictment. It's more than 50 pages, and it tracks events going back to 2016. You don't assemble that in a week. Southern District investigators were obviously building an Adams case for years, probably before Williams was even named U.S. Attorney, which happened in 2021, and long before Adams cozied up to Donald Trump. On top of all that, suspicion of corruption has swirled around Adams' head practically since he took office. The notion that the filing of the Adams indictment was somehow tied to his refusal to talk nice about Kamala Harris before the election is the kind of absurd conspiracy that used to be laughable in this country, consigned to the John Birch margins before the right-wing media promoted this kind of thinking to the extent that it became imprintable on millions of fevered minds. But remember, that's only the first factor cited by Bove and Bondi. The second, if you can believe it, is far more ridiculous. The indictment against Adams needs to be dropped, post-haste, Bondi ordered, because it's distracting him from doing his job. I'm not joking. The pending prosecution has unduly restricted Mayor Adams' ability to devote full attention and resources to the illegal immigration and violent crime that escalated under the policies of the prior administration. This is, to put it politely, not how the law works in this country, and we have a phrasing for that, of course. There you go.
That is not how this works!
Right, exactly. Even if you can say it a little calmly, might work out just the same. Anyway, this is not how things work in this country. Remember that the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that even a sitting president can't be immune from civil litigation on the grounds that it will distract him from his duties. But that was about Bill Clinton, a scourge of the right. For a darling of the right, the rules appear to be different. Except that the dismissal of these charges carries a big asterisk. They were dismissed, quote, without prejudice, meaning that they can be refiled anytime Bondi or Donald Trump wants them to be. In other words, Mayor Adams is too busy fighting crime and immigration, but only for as long as Bondi and Trump think he's fighting it their way. Once he's not, cuff him. So, that's how things go in a nation where it is openly declared that some people are above the law. That was not supposed to be the United States, although often it has been in the case of rich people. It was supposed to be places like Daniel Ortega's Nicaragua, where that stuff happened, but now it is the United States. I didn't declare it so. Trump did. More specifically, his White House counsel, David Warrington, did last week, in the form of a memo obtained by the Washington Post stating that it is now the official policy of the Trump administration that the president and vice president, what? Why? And their top lawyers, quote, can discuss ongoing criminal and civil cases with the Attorney General and her deputies. In other words, Trump or Vance can make one phone call and set an investigation, if they wish, in motion, or get one quashed. In other words, they are the law. But don't forget the central role here of Bondi. As authorized by the Attorney General, she has proven in a week that she will corrupt her office to any point and in any way that Trump desires. Don't take it from me, take it from Sassoon, a Republican and Federalist Society member who, far from thinking Adams innocent, was about to file a superseding indictment charging him with even more corruption, including tampering with evidence. And take it from the 5 Justice Department prosecutors who followed Sassoon with their resignations. This is a crisis, a legal and constitutional crisis of a sort seen only a few times in this country's history, and yet the squashing of the Adams case will pass, as all these things will pass, with nary a peep from elected Republicans because a serial liar with a mighty propaganda machine working overtime for him has convinced half the country that up is down, that honor is venality, and that integrity is just a ruse for suckers who believe all that garbage from our school books. How about that? Well, seems to have hit the nail on the head with that one. Just thought it would be a good wrap up and a reminder not to leave Bondi's name out of this in our rush to make fun of the weird and evil looking Emile Beauvais.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, well, thanks for bearing with us for an extra couple of minutes on today's show. We'll be back live before the mic on Thursday. I think we're okay for a Friday show, too. Greg Dworkin will join us tomorrow for the regular live segment, and we'll wrap up this crazy week and get the hell out of here. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll see you tomorrow.